I didn't think we'd be talking about Stanley Johnson in 2023 still.
This might be the most painful conversation we have in the history of the podcast. It hurts me to talk about this. It really does. Were you a big fan of his when he came out of the NBA, out of college, when the Pistons drafted him?
I mean, for the most part, yeah. Like, I remember it was like Stanley Johnson and Justice Winslow.
Yep.
And there was I don't want to say there was not a single person talking about Devin Booker, because I do think there were like a small flock of fans, but not how it is today. Like, I always see like fans, like, they wait until the players to go and say, told you we should have drafted Devin Booker. Told you we should have drafted Donovan Mitchell. It's just like, you were saying that during the whole draft process, but I don't know. Like, I thought it was either going to be Stanley Johnson or Justice Winslow. Those are the two like small forwards I was looking at coming out of college.
Who did you want more between the two? Because I was a huge Justice Winslow fan. That's who I wanted the Pistons to draft at number 8.
I wanted Justice Winslow, but something about Stanley Johnson's defense just kind of screamed Detroit. So that's who I wanted. But yeah, man, it's kind of crazy that, people are calling him a bust.
Well, he called himself a bust, didn't he, on the interview? He said that he was a bust in Detroit.
He was asked, do you consider yourself a bust? And he said, he's like, I tried and did my best. Like, I wasn't happy with how it ended in Detroit. And I can respect that for him taking accountability, but I never really considered him a bust. I thought him defending LeBron the way he did at such a young age, I was hopeful. I don't blame his tenure solely on him. I blame it more on the organization and coaching.
I will, man, as much as I wanted Justice Winslow, I was a fan of Stanley Johnson. I was super, like, I mean, way before I had a podcast, my buddy had texted me and he's like, what do you think about Stanley Johnson? This was, like I said, way before the podcast. I went back and I read the text. I remember this conversation and I said, I called him the next Ron Artest with a splash of Grant Hill. That's what I thought Stanley Johnson was when he got drafted. Because, like you were saying, the defense, he was 240 pounds just of muscle coming out of college. And I thought he was going to be a good one coming out of Arizona. And maybe the Grant Hill was, actually both comparisons are pretty ridiculous now looking back at it. But the Grant Hill one, because remember his highlight tape from high school, just how insane he looked against just average high school athletes? He looked great. And that's probably where the Grant Hill stuff came in. Maybe the rebounding too, I don't know. But my biggest knock on him, and let me just really quick say, I do think he was a bust in Detroit. I mean, going 8th overall, there were some ridiculous expectations for him. It just somehow didn't work. You could blame it on coaching. You could blame it on the injury. You could just blame it just playing in the city of Detroit, as some people would like to say. But my biggest knock on Stanley Johnson in his time in Detroit was finishing in the half court, man. I've talked about this before. He was soft going to the against smaller players. I think that was his biggest knock. It seemed like there was a real fear of him going to the rim against taller players. I don't know if he was afraid of contact or not. I mean, nobody likes to get hit in the face, but it felt like with his athleticism, his length at that 3 spot, that quick first step, he could get to the rim, but he had a hard time finishing up and over and through people. And I felt like he settled a lot with his floater, with the layups, and that's really what cost him more. And that's why I label him a bust with his time in Detroit, just because of that. Everything else was fine. I felt like the jumper was good. I felt like the dribble could have been tighter, but I kind of felt like at some point he could have kind of been like a point forward. Maybe you wouldn't want him running the offense, but with the handle and the athleticism, you could see him just picking some guys apart on defense. But it was that finishing. That was the biggest thing for me.
The reason why I said I don't consider him a bust was because of Stan Van Gundy, and I'll explain why.
Okay.
During his rookie year, if he made one single mistake, whether that was maybe he took a bad shot from, maybe it was a bad three-pointer, maybe he missed a defensive assignment, maybe it was a backdoor cut he missed, Van Gundy never really let him learn from a mistake like a Coach Casey did. Like, if he made a mistake, he was on the bench. And sometimes it does work for certain players where they can watch and say, oh, okay, that's how I'm supposed to do it. But other players, which I feel if you let Stanley Johnson learn through a mistake, maybe his career would have panned out a little bit differently. I know for me personally, if someone yells at me for making a mistake and I don't get to learn through that experience, I'm going to screw up again.
Yeah.
Like, that's just my thought process. And I don't even want to bring this up, but his mom passed away right after he got drafted. And that was probably really hard on him mentally to even, go to training camp like he did mention in that podcast interview. So I think it was more of the coaching and Van Gundy just using him as a spot up shooter when he wasn't a 3-point shooter coming out of college. Like, that was not his strength. Like, they just put him in the corner to spot up from three. So that's why I don't really consider him a bust. I think it was more of an organizational failure of trying to make him something that he's not. Kind of like how the Pistons did with Sadiq Bey. Like, we talked about it this year. Like, the Pistons did the same thing with Sadiq Bey. They stand in the corner and shoot threes. We want you to be a 3-level scorer. Like, I think it's more of the Pistons not being able to develop these guys coming out of college. And, Van Gundy just saying, hey, like, if you're going to make a mistake, you're going to be on the bench.
Yeah, no, that's all fair. And I believe it's an accumulate. Wow, I can't even say that word. It's just all these different things that factor into Stanley Johnson being a bust in Detroit. It wasn't just, if I'm talking about him specifically as a player, I felt like the finishing was the reason that was harder for him. I felt like he ended up settling more on offense. But you're right, Stan Van Gundy, I remember those games. He didn't give him a fair chance. You were right. There were times he would play, I feel like, for a minute. He maybe would run up and down the court once, 2, 3 times, and then he's right back on the bench. And I'm the same way. If you're going to yell at me, like, show me and then teach me so then I can apply it the next time, whatever I'm doing. Just don't scream at me and, I don't know, make me an example, I guess. Try to teach me so I can actually learn from mistakes, or give me the experience to do it. I'm the same way. So I don't blame it all on Stanley Johnson, but there are things that are in his power that he can control where it could have changed. But do you think if he had been drafted to another organization, his career turns out differently? Because I was thinking, man, if he goes to Miami or if he goes to Toronto, one of those teams, maybe it's a little different for him.
I think situation is everything. I look at a team like San Antonio, who we always joke saying, like, hey, if Stanley Johnson went to San Antonio, he'd be a monster. Pop would get him right. I think if he did get drafted by another organization, a good organization, I want to say, you mentioned a few, Miami, Toronto, you can even throw Denver in the mix. I think situation is everything. I just think if you look at the Detroit Pistons history since the Darko draft, the Pistons really haven't developed any of their first-round draft picks.